Hey friends! Tonight we're drifting into the scroll-filled moonlit city of ancient Alexandria, a place where cats rule the alleys. Philosophers argue with birds, and every breeze carries the scent of salt, ink, and maybe burnt bread. Before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what we do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always lovely to see where this sleepy little story reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum. Because tonight the scrolls are breathing, the cats are watching, and somewhere a tired scholar is trying to decide if stars have opinions. Welcome to Alexandria. In the heart of ancient Alexandria, just down the road from a bakery that burned its bread every third morning, stood the most famous building in the world, the Great Library, or as the locals called it, that scroll place with all the sandals out front. At night it was quiet, not spooky quiet, just polite. The kind of quiet that books prefer when they're trying not to be misquoted. Inside, rows and rows of papyrus scrolls sat stacked in tall wooden shelves. They held all sorts of knowledge, maps, science, poetry, and recipes that may or may not have caused stomach problems. Over 500,000 scrolls, if the records are to be believed. Though, to be fair, some of those were probably just shopping lists filed under philosophy. A single oil lamp burned near the entrance, casting a soft golden light on the marble floor. That same marble had once been polished by the sandals of scholars, students, and one guy who kept pretending he knew Greek just to impress a librarian. Somewhere in the corner, a cat, because of course there was a cat, stretched out on a scroll, titled, "The Uses of Sand in Construction." Unread, obviously. The air smelled of parchment, dust, and the distant hope that maybe someone would finally return that scroll on astronomy they borrowed 6 years ago. Outside, the waves from the harbor brushed softly against the shore. Sailors snored on their boats. And the stars blinked down, probably wondering why humans needed so many scrolls to remember how to cook lentils. And in that peaceful, book-filled room, history sat quietly, waiting to be opened. In a small clay-walled home tucked behind a market that always smelled faintly of fish and regret, a philosopher stirred from his mat. His name was Theon, and like most philosophers in Alexandria, he owned 2 tunics, 3 scrolls, and absolutely no practical skills. Theon yawned, scratched at his beard, and immediately launched into a whispered debate with himself about the nature of dreams. This lasted until his stomach interrupted with a loud growl, the eternal reminder that thinking doesn't fill your belly. He lit a small lamp, more out of habit than need. The sun was beginning to rise, but philosophers preferred shadows, easier to think in, and you don't have to clean. On the floor, a half-finished scroll lay open beside a dull reed pen. It was supposed to be a treatise on ethics, but mostly contained doodles of amphorae and a very smug-looking goat. Theon nodded solemnly at it, as if it had taught him something overnight. He tied on his sandals, left foot first, as tradition dictated, though no one really remembered why. Then he gathered his thoughts into a bundle only he could carry. Today, he would go to the library. Not to read, mind you, but to argue with a man named Diodoros about whether wind could think. He stepped outside into the golden hush of early morning. A neighbor waved. Theon waved back and immediately forgot the man's name. Likely a poet. They were everywhere. As he walked, the city around him slowly blinked awake. Merchants lifted shutters. Children chased each other with sticks, and a chorus of chickens voiced strong opinions about sunrise. Theon grinned to himself. A new day, a new argument, and maybe, if the gods were kind, a cup of watered wine before noon. Children, the city of Alexandria, ancient and half asleep, welcomed him, with the warmth of old stone and the rustle of parchment in the breeze. The Library of Alexandria was, by all accounts, magnificent. Tall columns, fragrant cedar shelves, and more scrolls than any one person could read in a lifetime, though a few very determined men were giving it their best shot. As Theon entered, he was hit by that familiar scent, old papyrus, melting candle wax, and the faint but persistent aroma of someone's lunch, hidden under a desk. He gave a courteous nod to the head librarian, who was busy whispering sternly at a parrot that had escaped the aviary again. The parrot, for its part, was quoting Plato. Badly. The main hall stretched before him, sunlight pouring through latticed windows, long bars of light spilled across mosaic floors. Students hunched over desks. Scribes argued in hushed tones, and somewhere deep in the stacks, a minor fire was being smothered with a toga. Business as usual. Theon weaved his way toward his favorite section: philosophy and other lost causes. Here, scrolls were piled high. Not necessarily by subject, but more by height and likelihood of falling over. He pulled a weathered one titled, "On the Soul of Wind," which he had borrowed, and never returned, several times. "Ah," said a familiar voice. "Back to torment Aeolus again?" Diodorus, his debate partner, and occasional source of migraines. He leaned against a shelf with arms folded like a statue that judged you. "Wind is fickle," Theon replied. "But it moves with intent. Like your arguments," Diodorus sniffed. They settled into their usual table. An unsteady thing that had once belonged to a minor pharaoh, and now squeaked in protest whenever anyone sat down too quickly. Around them, scrolls rustled like dry leaves. A cat strolled across the marble floor like it owned the building. It probably did. For the next hour they argued. Not loudly, but intensely. Like two men trying to decide whether reality was a suggestion or just poorly explained. Students nearby stopped to listen. Then quickly wandered off once it became clear there would be no explosions or sword fights. By the time the sun had shifted halfway across the sky, Theon was no closer to proving wind had feelings. But he was satisfied. The real joy wasn't in winning. It was in making Diodorus roll his eyes so hard they nearly fell out. He stood, stretched, and left the scroll where it lay. Tomorrow, he would come back. Or not. The wind would decide. The Agora of Alexandria was less a marketplace, and more a sensory overload in architectural form. A labyrinth of aromas, colors, shouted opinions. It was where you could buy everything from honeyed dates to philosophical despair, often sold by the same vendor. Theon stepped in, and the din hit him like a chariot wheel to the shin. Somewhere, a woman was aggressively selling amphorica by yelling directly into each one. As if the echo made them more convincing, beside her, a man claimed his myrrh cured boredom, baldness, and betrayal. "Rub it on your enemies," he insisted. "They'll disappear." Stalls overflowed with figs, textiles, salted fish, and the occasional philosopher trying to fund his next treatise with discount logic puzzles. A goat, nobody's yet everyone's problem, wandered between stalls like a furry auditor. Theon wasn't there to shop, he was hunting inspiration. He paused at a spice vendor's table, eyeing mounds of saffron, cumin, and something labeled, "Absolutely not sand." The vendor, a wiry man with more mustache than face, gave him a nod. "Looking to impress a lady, or poison a rival?" "Just browsing," Theon replied, pocketing a pinch of something mysteriously floral. He wandered on, slipping past a heated argument between two olive merchants. One claimed his olives were brined in tradition, the other said they just used seawater. Further down, a troupe of performers reenacted the siege of Troy, using only puppets, a lyre, and wild gesturing. The crowd laughed at the horse joke every time. In the corner of the square, Theon found a familiar face. Demetria the paper seller. Now she dealt in parchment, and parchment-related gossip. Today she was hand-binding scrolls while telling a tale about a love triangle involving a cartographer, a cart, and someone named Phyllis. "I need something quiet," he said. "Something that smells like ink and regret." Demetria handed him a fresh sheet. "Perfect for philosophy, or love letters you'll never send." Theon smiled. "Both, probably." As the sun leaned westward, the marketplace shifted. The volume lowered, the bartering softened. Musicians began tuning lyres for the evening crowd. He tucked the parchment under his arm and turned for home, heart oddly lifted. Among the chaos and comedy of Alexandria's marketplace, he found exactly what he didn't know he needed: the absurd comfort of other people's lives. Back in the cool shadow of the Serapeum Library, the lesser-known sibling to the Great Library, Theon returned to his work. The air smelled of old papyrus, fresh ink, and just a hint of existential dread. It was perfect. The reading room was quiet, except for the occasional sneeze of a scholar overwhelmed by ancient dust, or ancient ideas. Scrolls lay half unfurled on marble benches. Some contained the secrets of the cosmos, others early attempts at chicken recipes. Knowledge did not discriminate. Theon set out his writing tools. A reed pen carved to an unforgiving point, a clay inkpot, and the fresh sheet of parchment that still smelled like Demetria's questionable perfume. He stared at it, willing ideas to appear. They didn't. He glanced across the aisle. A young apprentice was trying to alphabetize scrolls in Linear B. He didn't know the alphabet, or the language. Another scholar was muttering at a diagram of the stars, shaking his head as if the stars had personally insulted him. "Remember," whispered a grey-bearded librarian as he crept past, "no open flames near the manuscripts. We learned that lesson the warm and destructive way." Theon nodded solemnly. Alexandria had a fire history. Not the romantic kind, the kind that required buckets and apologies to posterity. Theon nodded a line. Crossed it a line. Crossed it out. Tried again. Something about memory and stars. It was decent, maybe even good, but it still didn't feel like enough. He wandered deeper into the stacks, past niches carved into the walls. Scrolls thicker than his patience filled every corner. He paused before one labeled "On the Nature of Laughter." He opened it. Nothing funny. Nearby, a statue of Thoth watched with eternal judgment. Theon gave it a glare. You try coming up with something insightful and original while the scroll catalogue is sorted by mood. Still, something stirred. Not quite inspiration. More like the whisper of it. The quiet rustle of papyrus, the dim shaft of light catching dust in the air, the sound of scholars sighing in existential synchronization, something. It was all fuel. He sat again. This time the words came slowly, like honey reluctant to leave the jar, but sweet nonetheless. Not perfect, but better. And outside the library's thick stone walls, Alexandria prepared for dusk. That lovely golden hour, when the city remembered how beautiful it was, before it had to cook dinner. As the sun began its slow descent toward the sea, Alexandria's rooftops transformed into a lazy mosaic of soft oranges, sleepy shadows, and idle chatter. Cats stretched themselves to improbable lengths, basking in the warmth of the final rays like furry sundials. Pigeons circled half-heartedly above the skyline, deciding whether to settle down or start a turf war with the seagulls. Families emerged from shaded doorways to sit beneath linen awnings. They sipped diluted wine and discussed the most pressing matters of the day. Mostly gossip. Occasionally philosophy, and once whether figs counted as dessert or a vegetable. From up high the city looked almost peaceful. You couldn't hear the merchants arguing over fennel prices, or the teenage boys knocking over amphorae. By accident. You just saw rooftops dotted with baskets, laundry lines, and the occasional reckless goat. Children darted between buildings, with the fluidity of mischief incarnate. They chased each other with sticks and laughter, and the kind of energy adults find both charming and exhausting. One ambitious child tried to launch a kite made of leftover scroll bindings and bad ideas. It got about 5 feet into the air before deciding gravity had a point. Nearby, a group of philosophers gathered on a tiled patio. They reclined like they'd invented it. Which, to be fair, they might have. One of them held a clay cup aloft, quoting something vaguely Socratic. Another misheard it, corrected him, and thus began a spiraling debate that would last 4 hours and end with no winner and a wine stain on someone's sandal. Theon, too, had climbed to his roof. He carried a jug of cool water and a scroll that refused to cooperate. He leaned back, letting the clay tiles press patterns into his elbows, and watched the city soften under the light. Alexandria at sunset was like an old song, a little worn, a little wistful, and still inexplicably moving. Down below, a fishmonger shouted his final offer of the day. A street performer played a tune on a lyre that might have been music or possibly just experimental noise. Somewhere in the harbor, a ship's horn echoed across the water like a sigh. And as dusk gathered its skirts and slipped over the rooftops, Alexandria exhaled. A city full of scrolls, salt cats, and just enough magic to keep going. As twilight soaked into the city's bones, the neighborhood bathhouse came alive in that quiet, steamy sort of way. Like a kettle, just about to whistle. From the outside it looked humble. A dome of weathered stone, cracked tiles clinging on like brave soldiers, and a faint scent of wet sandals and overconfidence. Inside, however, was a realm of gentle echoes, sandalwood steam, and unapologetic nudity. The men's side was filled with gruff laughter, grunted philosophy, and the occasional shout of, "That's my strigil, Publius." Old men soaked their joints and told the same stories they told every week, mostly about gladiators they definitely met, women they probably didn't, and fish that got bigger with every retelling. Across the partition, the women's section was quieter, except for the sharp rhythm of gossip, passed back and forth like hot coals. Hands worked soap into hair, oils into skin, and sarcasm into sentences with effortless grace. One woman recounted her neighbor's latest romantic disaster, in tones usually reserved for epic poetry. Another had just discovered her cousin's husband was not at Scroll Club after all. The attendants moved through the steam like friendly ghosts. They offered warm towels, refilled bowls of scented water, and expertly ignored conversations not meant for them. Somewhere deep in the belly of the place, a furnace roared softly. Like a dragon hired part-time, even Theon, ever the introvert, found solace in the bathhouse. He sat in a tiled alcove, head tilted back, letting the steam untie the knots of the day. His scrolls could wait. For now, there was just the sound of trickling water, the hiss of hot stones, and the soothing anonymity of shared relaxation. One man near him had fallen asleep mid-soak, snoring softly into the crook of his arm. Another was monologuing about the superiority of Egyptian bath salts over Greek ones, blissfully unaware that no one was listening. And as the moon rose outside, casting a pale glow through the narrow windows, the bathhouse exhaled in harmony with the city. The clamor of Alexandria melted into murmurs and mist, the kind that clings to skin and secrets alike. Here time paused. Here everyone was equal. Philosophers, fishmongers, lovers, and liars, all gently poached like figs in a communal teapot. At this hour, the great library of Alexandria was technically closed. But closed was more of a suggestion than a rule, especially if you knew which apprentice had a soft spot for figs and a loose grip on policy. The main hall was vast and solemn. It smelled of parchment, dust, and just the faintest whiff of superiority. Scrolls stood in tall cubbies like judgmental snakes, watching you with silent expectation. Every footstep echoed like you were walking across the mind of the universe. And yet, tonight, the library was far from still. In a far corner, 3 young scholars whispered fiercely over a stubborn scroll. It was written in 3 languages, none of which they actually spoke. One insisted the smudged word meant cosmic harmony. Another was sure it meant wine jug. The third quietly copied it into his notebook, labeled it definitely important, and moved on. Elsewhere, an elderly cataloger named Doris, yes, even Alexandria had a Doris, dozed upright at her desk, quill still in hand, dreaming, perhaps, of perfectly aligned shelf labels and obedient papyrus margins. Theon drifted through the rows, like a man chasing his own thoughts. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. That was the magic of the place. You didn't find what you were looking for. You found what you needed, whether you understood it or not. He paused beside a worn scroll about stellar rotations, and accidentally knocked loose a foot-thick roll titled, "The Proper Grooming of Royal Beards." Somewhere a librarian flinched in her sleep. By candlelight the ancient text seemed to breathe. The ink shifted with every flicker of flame. Knowledge hummed in the air. Thick, golden, slightly pretentious. In the scriptorium, 2 scribes argued quietly over the spelling of a foreign king's name. Maioi. It's an eye, I swear. That's not an eye, that's a smudge. Well, it's a very confident smudge. Nearby, a young girl with ink-stained fingers practiced copying symbols onto a shard of broken pottery. She wrote slowly, with reverence, as if her clay might someday find its way into history. And as Theon climbed the narrow stairs to the upper shelves, the ones filled with mysterious foreign works and warnings like, "Do not touch unless you can translate Sanskrit," he smiled. Here, surrounded by thousands of years of human noise, distilled into curling letters, he felt small and deeply comforted. Because if the library stood for anything, it was this, that someone, somewhere, had also stayed up too late asking strange questions, and decided to write down the answers. Back out on the marble steps of the museum, the night had grown cooler. The breeze from the sea had finally remembered its job, to be dramatic and a little damp. Alexandrians, being creatures of habit and excellent weather, had begun their evening ritual of loitering. Sandals shuffled. Olives were nibbled. Debates erupted like polite brushfires. You could barely walk a block without overhearing someone arguing about ethics, astronomy, or whether figs were better fresh or dried. The consensus was both, passionately. Theon leaned on a column, chewing on a piece of bread that was definitely past its prime, still edible if you believed hard enough. Across the street, a knot of philosophers had formed a loose, circular argument. Each one took turns pretending to listen, before launching into their own monologue. One of them wore a toga so patched, it looked more like a philosophical quilt. An old man shouted, "The stars control fate," to no one in particular. A younger man replied, "Then tell them to stop making me trip on cobblestones." Laughter followed. Someone passed around dates. Even the cats looked contemplative. A lanky student tried to impress a woman by quoting Homer, but mispronounced Odysseus as odd socks. She groaned. A nearby tabby meowed in judgment. Above them, the stars began their slow performance. In Alexandria, the heavens weren't just for wishing. They were for measuring, charting, arguing over whether they were spheres or just very shiny dots with opinions. Theon watched the sky from the edge of the square, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Somewhere out there, he knew, were worlds too distant to name. And right here, a man in a robe was arguing with a fig seller about Aristotle's moral failings. In other cities, nighttime meant stillness. But in Alexandria, even this late, the air buzzed. Not just with words, but with curiosity. That, and the smell of roasted chickpeas. As the last candles guttered, and sandals shuffled home, Alexandria finally exhaled. Theon wandered slowly down a narrow alley behind the museum. Ivy crept up the limestone walls. The smell of ink, wax, and slightly scorched parchment still lingered. A cat padded ahead of him like a silent, judgmental tour guide. It didn't wait for him to open doors. Cats of Alexandria had standards. He passed the bakery shutters, still warm, past the astrologer's stall, closed, with a note that read, "Back after the next lunar eclipse." And into the small courtyard of his home, Theon paused. Above, the stars were smeared across the sky like careless chalk. A soft spattering of logic-defying beauty. A soundless map, waiting to be read by the patient, or the permanently underemployed. Careless more, he sat on a stone bench near a sleepy vine and poured a small cup of water. No wine tonight. He was tired, and still suspicious of the last bottle, which had turned vinegary and, according to his neighbor, aged ungracefully. Inside, the oil lamp flickered gently. Buttery shadows moved along the walls. Books leaned lazily on one another. Scrolls curled in their sleep like old dogs. The remains of a fig tart dared him to finish them. Theon didn't. Some things were better left for the morning, like complex thoughts, or tart regrets. In the warm hush of Alexandria, surrounded by ink-stained dreams and the faint hum of a city too clever for its own good, Theon closed his eyes. No great discovery. No dramatic ending, just the soft sigh of parchment, the twitch of a sleeping cat, and the moon peeking through the window like it had gossip to share. Sleep, at last, took its turn, and Alexandria, clever and chaotic, whispered goodnight.